right, let's get started. So thank you for being here. We do have quite a lot in the room and also online. Thank you for attending our translation research seminar on Friday. My name is Yu Zhang, and I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering, as well as the program director for advanced air mobility research at Carter Center for Urban Transition Research. And this seminar is sponsored by both the department and the center, and also facilitated by IT student chapter. Okay, so today we have, I want to mention today's event actually is co-organized by USF, CE Department Carter, as well as the WTS Tampa Bay. So WTS, the full name, which do not use anymore, is Women's Transition Seminar. So it's an organization to advance women advancing transportation. And the Tampa Bay chapter established like almost 20 years ago. And in the last 4 years, actually, I served as a president of that organization. And now the president is Homer Fatash, Dr. Homer Fatash, a transition professionals working in local company. So today I'm going to introduce our presenter and Ms. Jolene Hayes. And she's a senior associate at the Fear Peers. And she has more than 25 years of experience in local, regional, and statewide transportation, land use, and good movement, port planning, analysis, and project implementation. So she used to work at Port of Long Beach, where she had, first-hand experience to balance between the benefits and impact of freight transportation on the local community, on the economy of local, regional, and national, and also the environment. And Ms. Hayes, she's a researcher. She participates in policy development in the local, regional, and the federal level. And also she's leading the NCHRP project and to develop a guidebook for the local tracking parking regulation. And she has co-authored some of the TRP research, including the autonomous freight mode and also on the supply chain resilience. Now, everybody know that during the COVID, actually, we had a big problem in the supply chain, right? And it caused the increase of prices of many goods and the delays of the delivery of many equipment, which affected the faculty member here. They couldn't set up their lab because of the delays. So actually, Jolene, she served as a moderator in a workshop spearheaded by U.S. DOT Secretary Buttigieg and also the Port of Long Beach to investigate, what has gone wrong and what could be the solutions. So I think that's a big, I would say, contribution to improve the supply chain during the COVID. So she has many other, accomplishments and also led some other important work. You can find more information from the flyer that we shared with you. Another last thing I want to mention is Julie is a dedicated mother with 5 children aged between 6 to 12, which I admire a lot. I only have 1 son. I don't know how you could manage that. So I really admire that. All right, so without further ado, I will give the stage to Jolene. Let's welcome our presenter today.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm still getting over a bit of a cold, so if I have to clear my throat occasionally, like right now, I apologize in advance. Let's see if I can put this in presenter mode. All right, okay, great. And I'm going to go ahead and grab this pointer because I'm going to need it at some point. But as was mentioned in the introduction, a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about in the beginning came out of these discussions with a lot of the industry leaders at the time, trying to figure out how to make sure that we're learning our lessons from what was going on with all the supply chain disruption. But then I'm also going to share some of what we talked about at the Transportation Research Board's meeting last month. So we had 2 different presentations that I'll mention as I go through, but SSA Marine and Meats and Logistics were part of letting me use some of their information for this. Just real quickly about our firm. So she mentioned that I do a lot of freight and Oh, I don't want to step in front of the screen here. I'll go this way. My background, I started out working as a city planner. Because as grad school researcher for Texas Transportation Institute, though, I quickly moved from land use planning into transportation planning and never really went back. Firsthand experience, though, with understanding freight movements and how important it is for city planners, loading zones. You can't build these high-rise buildings and not have a place for a moving truck to stop. Traffic would start backing up, but that was my first touch. And then I ended up going to work for the Port of Long Beach, and it was a completely different animal. But us as a firm, we do all types of planning, bike planning, transit planning, modeling. I just happen to be in the freight group. I get to work on some of the other stuff still, but we have offices all over the country. So a lot of what I do is trying to help support them with freight planning, not just at ports, but cities are dealing with this a lot. Okay, so the supply chain issues. What happened, lessons learned, and the research needs. This is what we're going to cover today. Probably going to talk fast, but if you have questions in between, please feel free to ask. And I will have a couple of stopping points. So where I will try to ask you some questions. So during the COVID-19 thing in California, it was a real issue. You heard about all the vessels that were shore. They were sitting offshore with the people who worked on those ships for up to 30 days, where they could see the land, but they can't get off the ship. So this is why this group got together. We took all pieces of industry and brought them together under Pete Buttigieg and the Port of Long Beach. So we had the shippers, the beneficial cargo owners, which are the people that own the stuff that we buy. We had the truck drivers. We had the warehouse operators, the developers, longshore labor at the ports, and we brought them all together. After that, there was and this is part of what came out of that conversation. So there was a GoBiz, which is a economic development arm of the state of California, did a survey asking the different respondents these questions. So they were asking, was the cause predictable or not? Could they have foreseen it? 47% thought it was foreseeable, but also unprecedented, whereas 25% thought it was completely unprecedented and never going to happen again. Look where we're at today with the Suez Canal. And then 22% thought it was completely foreseeable, that we could have done some better planning to prevent what we saw happen. The next question that got asked was supply chain disruptions. They do not only lead to immediate challenges, but also force potentially permanent changes in the operation of business. This was a statement, and they had to respond to what they thought was going to happen with this. So increased costs and have caused changes in operations. That was number one. And this is what we saw with different gateways being used. So LA Long Beach were backing up. So all of a sudden, what happened a few months later? New York, New Jersey was backing up. So the industry is very reactive, and it's really hard for us as planners to try to figure out where the next big problem is going to happen and how to help alleviate that. The other things were customer satisfaction was a concern. Labor shortages were a major concern, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And just the overall inability to meet production deadlines. You think of inputs to production. So a lot of what we were seeing with our empty shelves, part of it was because the stuff was stuck on a ship, but some of it was the inputs to production here domestically couldn't get to the manufacturers. So local businesses really depend on the supply chain to succeed. So based on the experience of what the supply chain was happening, what was happening in the supply chain, this is what they said they would support as far as public policy actions. 48% thought it was completely out of control and that something needed to be done. 23% of the time of this survey, which this is the end of 21, thought it was getting better. Only 23%. Some thought it would never be solved. And some just left the industry altogether because they thought it would never be solved. So what really happened? And this is a really good picture of what I mentioned with, this was the on the left-hand side, well, I guess it's the dark picture in the screen. How about that? But that was the queue of vessels that we saw happening out of the ports of LA and Long Beach. And this was when everybody was trying to get their stuff back in. But then you see what happened when all of a sudden the factories in Shanghai closed. So only 20 to 50% of them were still operating. So the picture that's the lighter picture, that's what happened after all those closures of the factories in China when they finally did the shutdown. So you can see it makes it very difficult, not only for the private industry to figure out how to get their goods, but what we as consumers and especially as planners and port planners trying to figure out how to accommodate these different flows of traffic that are coming through our facilities. So during that same time frame, as I mentioned, LA Long Beach hit that decline, and a lot of stuff shifted to New York, New Jersey. So we started seeing these waves of what's happening in the container flows and where it's coming from. One of the biggest things that happened for our exporters, a lot of our exports are ag. They're in the middle of the country. So what was happening is these vessels, in order to try to accommodate the surge of stuff that started coming back to the US, they would dump it at the closest port instead of going up the coast, like from China to the US on the Pacific side. They usually go into LA Long Beach, then Oakland, then sometimes Portland. Portland usually gets skipped, and then up to Seattle, and then they go back. And they're picking up and dropping off as they go along. During this, because there was such demand to hurry and get stuff out of China, the ships were dropping everything in LA Long Beach. Same with on the East Coast, dropping everything in New York, New Jersey, instead of going down the coast to their normal ports. So that's why we had these bottlenecks of empty containers sitting everywhere that everybody's like, oh my gosh, how do we deal with this? And those Midwest exports that were depending on those containers to be able to get into the middle of the country, same thing was happening with the inland rail. So that's why we saw the bottleneck in Chicago. Trains were going directly into Chicago, dumping everything and turning right back around to go back to Long Beach. They were missing all of those smaller destinations that they usually served. So the Midwest couldn't get the containers to ship their stuff out. We lost a lot of commodities that year. And the precision scheduled railroading wasn't helping. So at the same time that all of this was going on with, trying to get stuff out, the railroads were really concerned about costs. So they started laying off crews, creating longer trains that went fewer destinations. So they still have a labor issue to this day and are having a lot of trouble trying to get stuff back onto rail. So talk a little bit about that rail congestion. So the BCOs were delaying picking up their cargo. And part of the reason they were delaying picking up their cargo is they didn't have a place to take it to. They couldn't get it on a train because the trains were backed up. They couldn't get it into a warehouse because the warehouses were backed up. So as I mentioned, that precision scheduled railroading, 45,000 jobs were cut by the railroads. All class ones were doing this. They were competing with each other. So the ports were kind of in the limelight at the time saying, why don't you open your gates 24/7? It's your fault. But even if they did, the dwell times for containers, they're usually 7 to 10 days. They were sitting on the port for 3 weeks because there wasn't a place to take them. So as I mentioned with the precision scheduled railroading, and this is still the case, and I know the railroads are starting to change back to their old ways, but they had a 10.4% decline in what was moving on rail from a year earlier at a time when we needed it the most. So there was even more demand. And like I said, they were taking those longer trains and dumping everything at one place. And so it caused just all kinds of problems in the system. The equipment shortages. So the chassis were blamed for a lot of this. So the export container companies, okay, and I know not all of you understand freight, so let me just get some terms for you real quickly. The containers that you see on the screen, those are the longer boxes are 40 feet long. Almost everything though for shipping is measured in 20-foot equivalent units. So the smaller box, which is about half the size of those, it's called a TEU. So when they start talking about TEUs now, they just mean a container, a short one, and that's just how they measure. But as I mentioned, the shortage, these containers go on what's called a chassis. So it's a trailer that these containers go on. See the trucks hauling them around. Those chassis are really important to moving these goods in and out of the ports. So what was happening is these containers would get stuck on a chassis, brought to a warehouse. The warehouses were suddenly taking 45 days versus 10 days to empty a box. So there wasn't room for these boxes to be, so they would just started being parked on the chassis. The truck driver would disconnect the chassis with the container and then take off. So these chassis, which there aren't a whole lot of them, are suddenly, there's none left. So they can't go to the port and pick up anything else because they're stuck under a box outside of a warehouse. So that's why we saw a lot of the congestion that we saw. I don't know if you noticed it out here, but anywhere along like a warehouse, you would have seen these trailers parked on the street. And it was because they couldn't get into the warehouse. Part of the reason why, there's not an additional incentive for the trucking companies to return the chassis because the chassis owners just do it on a per day basis. So there wasn't really a huge incentive. There's no penalty for not returning it within a certain amount of time. So that's part of the problem. The railroad congestion also, like I said, it really limited the availability of empties. So empty containers to push stuff on. But if we couldn't get the chassis and the container to them, it just caused this whole domino effect of what was going on in the supply chain. And even in South Carolina ports, it delayed them having, they were launching a new chassis pool. But part of what was happening is they couldn't even produce chassis. So even though these companies saw the shortage and wanted to go out and buy them, all the inputs to production were stuck on a ship out at sea and couldn't get to the manufacturing to build the chassis. So it's just this end over end effect. Overall shipping costs increases. I mean, we saw 10 times the cost for a container. So it was $2,000 to fill up a container with bicycles, you know, just 6 months earlier is now $20,000. That's why we saw such inflation on a lot of our goods, because it was really expensive to ship them. And then you also had to pay people a lot more to come back to work because they were being paid to stay home. So you saw these wage increases. The price of diesel fuel went up. All of this was contributing to inflation. But the labor shortage was number one. So this group that we were talking to, we had this, you know, we had these two big roundtable breakouts with all the industry leaders in Long Beach at the time. And it came down to a lot of things. The truck drivers, so many of them had left the industry. Can you imagine driving a long haul truck, say from Florida to New York? All the restaurants are closed. Most of the stores are closed or limited, and you can't park a truck at most stores anyways. And all the rest areas were closed because of COVID concerns. So these truck drivers started realizing, hey, my job really stinks. It was hard before, but now it's like impossible. So they started leaving the industry. Warehouse workers weren't coming back. A lot of them that had left during COVID because of not being able to go to work realize that they can do blue collar jobs online and make just as much money and be able to stay home with their kids. Railroad workers, as I mentioned, they were laid off, but they found other jobs. Chassis manufacturers, same thing, and so on and so forth. So we just had an overall labor shortage, but it hit the warehouses the hardest. And everybody blamed the truck drivers for not going to the port, but yeah, there weren't enough of them. But the warehouse workers was number one. They had social distancing requirements within the warehouses themselves, so they couldn't move as much product through the warehouses. That's why we saw that surge to 45 days to move stuff out of the warehouses. So there were some solutions that have come out of this, and they were really helpful. So the peel-off yards, especially here on the East Coast, were extremely successful in alleviating some of the congestion at the ports and helping to move the containers more quickly, bringing empties back, getting those on ships, making those more available to exporters. So that was one of the things that did work in limited places. But data sharing and visualization, and this is something that USDOT did a great job on. They were able to, they had been trying to do this for about 10 years. The this data sharing. It was called blockchain at one point, but there were different ways that it was funded. But this time, because the industry needed to be able to look 3 months ahead, what do I see around the horizon? Is there a big surge or something that I should be paying attention to? So USDOT has been very successful in getting a lot of these industry partners. So the beneficial cargo owners, the shipping lines, meaning the railroads, the vessel operators, the terminal operators, to all share data. So they can see in advance, like how far, like if an order is placed 3 months ago, they'll have an idea of what type of equipment it's going to be on, the route it's going through, the gateway it's going to come in. And they all have non-disclosure agreements. So that's the only way they're sharing their data. But it's actually one of the best solutions that has been coming out of this. And we're starting to see more trust in the industry. Dwell time limits and demurrage fees. The Port of Long Beach like blasted a newspaper article saying we're going to start charging you, I think it was like $1,000 a day. I'm totally misquoting that, but it was enough of a price tag to scare the industry into moving the containers off the docks pretty quickly. And they never actually put it into effect. It was more of a, look, you guys, we need to work together. You got to move this off. Then the peel off yards really helped with that, but also raising wages and getting workers back into the warehouses, bringing truck drivers back into the industry. That was really helpful. And some of the they were able to get some training for younger drivers, for example. The universities have stepped in and been helping with that, especially at the community college level. Those have been some of the success stories. So before I go into what's happening today, I know I just threw a lot of information at everybody. And I don't know how I can get questions from anybody online. Or do you ever have questions from people online?
Yes. Let me get into the.
Does anybody here in the room have any questions? Because I just dumped a bunch of stuff on you.
Any questions from online audience?
Okay, then I'll just keep going. I'm glad nobody looks like they're falling asleep though. So what's happening today, and this is what we've all been seeing a lot of in the media. And I think this is why, from a research perspective, it's so important for us to learn from COVID. There's continuous supply chain disruptions that are happening for a lot of different reasons. Could be bad weather. God forbid we ever have a major earthquake in Southern California that knocks out LA Long Beach, for example. But we also have labor negotiations, and those are going on right now on the East Coast. We just got through with it on the West Coast last year, and those slow down the flow of goods through ports. The Ukraine conflict and where goods are coming from. So they were a major wheat producer, for example. So now our Midwest farmers are shipping out a lot of grain, and it's going to places that it didn't go to before. So trying to figure out those pathways is important. We're also dealing with some climate change effects, extreme weather events that are causing droughts in places that we didn't traditionally have like issues. So Panama Canal, for example, and then the Israel-Gaza conflict and the full closure for all commercial shipping right now of the Suez Canal. So that's what I'm going to go through real quick. So the geopolitical challenges, and this is just to give you a sense of what's going on with the Suez Canal, and this is where I'll use my pointer. So the Suez Canal is right here. So what happens most of the time, a lot of everything that's produced in India, for example, instead of going the longer way and coming across the Pacific Ocean, for the most part, everything produced in India, which is a lot now, comes through the Suez Canal and then comes over to the East Coast. Right now, it can't go through the Suez Canal. It's just way too dangerous. So right now, it's going all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and then coming over. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now. Well, I guess before I leave this map, And what the Panama, it's kind of the same thing. Instead of going through here, has to go all the way down around South Africa, which is a much longer and more dangerous. Going around the Cape is harder. So the Suez Canal is really critical link. And this is a slide that was from S&P Global. So they do, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Journal of Commerce, but this is some data that they shared at TRB this last year. Carries 12% of global trade. It carries 30% of everything that goes into a container. So probably everything that you're wearing right now came through on a container. Everything you buy at the store comes through on a container, plastics and all those products. 30% of global is a lot. The Cape of Good Hope adds 7 to 10 days of transit time, and it costs 15% more. So again, leading the inflation that we're still experiencing, part of it is because of the shipping costs. So the latest news, and this is what was shared last month at TRB, some of this came from Houston Logistics, some of it came from SSA Marine, but all major shipping lines had ceased moving any product through the Suez Canal by February, well, earlier this month. But even as of December, most of the goods were already starting to travel other ways. Rerouting requires 1.4 to 1.7 million TEUs of additional capacity. So these vessels, thankfully, the vessel lines had overinvested, and they were concerned coming out of the pandemic that, oops, we have too much capacity. We're going to be in the red again. And then all of a sudden this happens. Thankfully, they had enough capacity because right now, because of this additional sailing time, almost 100% of the capacity for these commercial ships is being used. So that oversupply was actually a really good thing. So that 6%, that's an additional, so 6% of everything that we move, that's how much more it takes to go that longer direction. Just going to give you an LPG tanker reroute. So this is from SSA Marine. It increases the voyage time. So going around Cape Hope increases voyage times by 50% versus the Panama Canal. So that was one piece of it. So on the left, the bar chart is reflective of the Suez Canal, but then you also see the effects that it's having on Panama on the other side of the screen. So you can see that the southbound is the dark blue on the bar chart. So those were the movements of petroleum through the Suez Canal. And then the lighter blue is the northbound. So you saw a significant change as you went across this on a daily basis, and it's cutting off the dates at the bottom of the screen. But we've had a lot that's had to shift out of the Suez Canal, and that's part of why we're experiencing such high fuel increases as well right now. Just go to the next one. So the Panama Canal, I'm going to shift to that since I started to allude to it in the last slide. 3% of global maritime trade goes through the Panama. So 3% is a lot lower. I mean, you look at right now, 6% increase in needed capacity to go the longer route. So 3% of total global trade, but of that 30% is container. It carries 30% of the world's containers. So that's most of the stuff that we need on a daily basis. 72% of all Panama traffic has an origin or destination in the United States. So we get hit the hardest by the Panama closure, or it's not really a closure. It's just Lake Gatun that is the main water source for helping the ships to transit through that piece of the world is 7 feet below its optimal level. So the draft restriction is now 44 feet instead of 50 feet. A lot of these vessels require, especially the larger container vessels, that was why the widening of the Panama Canal was so critical. Well, it was a big concern for West Coast ports. It was a huge boon for East Coast ports. So how we saw so much of a shift in containers going to East Coast ports. So the growth in South Carolina and all the growth in even like Jacksonville and other ports in Florida benefited from the Panama Canal because of that draft. That's how deep the vessel goes into the water. Those larger ships can't go through right now. And instead of them waiting a couple of days to get through in line, now it's 3 weeks. So the transit time is considerably more because they can't push as many vessels through because of the water constraints. So not only are the ships smaller, but fewer of them are getting through. And this just gives you an example of, like, you can see the line there in the bottom, the squiggly one on that side over there where it talks about the water levels. 2023 is the lowest it's been in many, this is going back to 2016, but I don't think we've ever seen it this low. We have never had an impact like this in the Panama Canal that has affected international trade at the same time that we have the Suez Canal closure. So the average daily transits, you can see how many, that red line, how they dropped. And especially the bottom chart really shows that 2022 to 2023, instead of having 28 ships through a day, you're down to 18. And you can just think of how that compounds, because it was already a couple days wait. Now it's just compounding up to 3 weeks, and it's probably going to become longer. That's the water level. So and I know it cut off on the bottom. I have the actual sheet I could send you. It shows it, but the lines on the top are like years ago.
Continues deteriorating, that's scary. If it's fluctuate from year to year, maybe because of the weather, yearly weather condition or something. That was my question.
Each one of those lines is a year.
Yeah, I know.
We have a pointer for this. So this line right here, this line is 2023. So yeah, it was much higher at the beginning.
How about
the orange one would have been 20. That's what I'm thinking. It's 2022. And this goes all the way to 2016. So each one of these lines, and for some reason, when I brought it into the screen, it dropped off the legend, and the legend would be really helpful. But I will send you the actual, the full chart with the legend that you can share when this presentation is shared, so that you'll have that information. But it's this, like you said, it does drop. It is seasonal, but it hasn't come back up. Is the problem. Yeah. And that's why we're dealing with this. It is seasonal, so there are dips in the water, but not to this extent. And we're seeing similar things with the Mississippi, so I didn't put that on here in the Missouri River. They're experiencing some of the same issues right now with droughts. So this was one of the other things that Houston Logistics brought up at TRV last month. And this is just one additional geopolitical issue that we're dealing with. It's just the U.S.-China trade challenges, or what we commonly in the media refers to as a trade war. But you can see where that's really had an impact. U.S. mainland China has really benefited Vietnam and Mexico, because as much as we put these tariffs on goods that are coming from China, those goods are still being manufactured in China. China just has to find a different market that can get those goods into the U.S. So a lot of what we're seeing coming into Mexico is actually the China trade that used to come into the U.S. directly. It's now going into Mexico and then coming up over the border, which is why we see such a surge in goods coming over the border. It's some of the manufacturing is coming back, which is good. It helps us avoid issues like the Suez Canal, Panama Canal, with trying to get things across the water. But we still have some of those same conditions because it's a global supply chain. Those inputs to the production in Mexico are still coming from Asia. They still have to cross over the water. So there are some benefits to having, and I think one of the biggest benefits for us from the US is just being able to provide jobs down in Mexico and further south, because those jobs are really needed down there as we see the surge of people trying to come over to the US to work. So there are some benefits of it, but ultimately the goods are still coming from China. So also saw this, it also this is where Mexico really benefited those, a 17.2% increase in 1 year because of those tariffs. So it's still entering the US. It's just going a longer route. One of the other things is that, as I mentioned, factories may be in China, but the trade ties are stronger than ever because of those inputs to production that are still so important. It is a global market. So many things. I mean, I think you've seen the thing about an iPhone. How many countries does it take to make an iPhone? The components are made all over the world and then brought together. So it really does impact the whole entire world when one of these major things happen in the supply chain. And again, just more of the nearshoring to Mexico. It's been increasing, but you can see the effects of China, Canada, Mexico, the U.S. tariffs. So that's what this chart shows. So I don't know if you can read that. You probably can't. But the blue line is here. I'll use my pointer again. The blue line on the top is China. The purplish line is Mexico, and then this green line down here is Canada. But you can see how each one of these affects. So U.S. tariffs on China, boom, you saw what was coming into. So China drops here, but then you can see where some of that got picked up. Mexico, Canada saw some increases at the time that we were dropping. So it just ends up moving around. COVID, everybody dropped off. Mexico took a little longer to drop off, but same with the Russia-Ukraine war right now. We're seeing that China drops the most, the others are benefiting, and China is still continuing to drop because of things that are happening with Russia and the Ukraine, and a lot of that has to do with oil. The same time, shipment volumes from Mexico to US are up 20%, which is why we're seeing such an influx that come over the border. Dwell times are down, so especially at ports, which is great, and intermodal facilities. They're down by 25%. So the containers are moving through the facilities much more efficiently, which means freight flows on our roadways and on our railways are more even and easier to manage. And what we're seeing between US and Mexico is really a lot of agriculture and autos. So the automobile industry, a lot of the manufacturers has moved down to Mexico, but there's a huge synergy between the US. So Texas has a lot of the manufacturing, California does. So there's a lot of back and forth with the production of those vehicles. So there are some real resiliency opportunities, and this is something that everybody's been working on. Workforce development, and it's not just making sure that we have people that are ready to use automated facilities, for example, or help to work on the equipment that goes into these warehouses, but it's even like training truck drivers and creating new opportunities for the workforce of the future. Monitoring these geopolitical challenges, I think that's really important. And so part of what I'm going to get to in a second when I think of research needs, and this is where if you guys have some ideas to add to this, that would be great. But key commodity sourcing options is also something. So these inputs to production, what are the alternatives? That's what the industry is always looking for. So is there an alternative to China when China was completely shut down? And they started getting really creative. So they started exploring other countries and where those could be produced and where they had backup plants. And a lot of them now are using more than one option for sourcing just to make sure that they don't stop everything when one of the pieces of their supply chain are disrupted. So redundancy is really important. We also have decarbonization challenges. So yes, we have these Panama Canal, Missouri, Mississippi River that are being affected by extreme climate change. But we also have some real technological challenges with trying to decarbonize our fleets. So California is really pushing hard to go zero emission, but the trucks an electric truck is twice the amount of a brand new diesel, and the diesel ones are becoming cleaner. Hydrogen fuel cell, 3 to 4 times more expensive. And we don't have the infrastructure. So the charging infrastructure, we certainly don't have enough power on the grid to support it yet. There's some great ideas out there, but same with hydrogen fuel. We just don't have enough production yet. So we have a lot of technical challenges to think about. It's one of the other challenges in supply chain disruption, because if the trucks in California, for example, can't meet this mandate, they won't be allowed to go into the ports and pick stuff up. What does that do to our overall supply chain? So just one of the other issues to think about when you're thinking about supply chain disruption. Research needs, so these were just my ideas. So we think that precision scheduled railroading does need to be revisited. And there's already been a lot of, with STB, Surface Transportation Board, or Surface Transportation Board. I got that right. They've already been having hearings with the Class 1 railroads on this and trying to make sure that they understand that it is a critical piece of our supply chain, and making sure that they operate as efficiently, but also as providing enough access to shippers as possible is really critical. One of the ideas that we heard when we were doing that big moderation roundtable was, most of the time right now, if you have a container that shows up at the port, you get notified that it's there, but they can come and pick it up whenever they want to. They can schedule an appointment tomorrow, next week. But what if the port said, no, you have to come and pick it up on this day between these hours? So forcing it to be pushed out instead of waiting for it to be pulled out. That could really help with the port scheduling and understanding how to stack their containers. Because right now you have a stack of containers 5 high. And if it's not an automated facility, you have a top pick, which is like the crane. Yes.
That makes lots of sense.
Because they've never done it that way.
Because previously they had enough capacity, they had enough space for them to sit there.
Yeah, and it would take, I think it would take a completely different mindset, and also just the processing. Right now, I mean, they do have an appointment system, but even with their appointment system, they allow the same container to have like 10 appointments scheduled in their system, because just in case they can't get there on time, if there's congestion or if they get stuck in another facility. So even that makes it really difficult for the ports to plan. And I think that's the challenge for the trucking companies, and why they might push back on it, is because it's hard for them to make those windows unless they're going to have a significant amount of downtime scheduled into that pickup, which means it's going to cost them a little bit more for the driver to guarantee that the driver can get there during that time.
It also stimulates some improvements in some sectors. Like now we got so good kind of online conference platforms, which we didn't have before. And I think COVID could be an opportunity to reshape this the supply chain or this industry.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where the research side is really fun to think about. Like, what are the things that we didn't think about before, like the push-pull? It could probably work if they gave you a day. And so if they knew all these containers were going to be picked up on this day, and they had from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. to pick it up, then maybe that's the way to make it work. But I don't know.
It sounds like the ports should take the initiative. I mean, not the researchers, because the benefits are so obvious and straightforward. And I think the ports should start doing something.
And it's interesting. Every port, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. They don't all operate anywhere near. I mean, for example, Ports of LA Long Beach, the property is owned by the city of Long Beach and the city of Los Angeles. They are harbor departments of the cities. So they're not state owned, they're local jurisdiction owned. And then the terminals are leased out. So they have these long leases, and they can put what they call tariffs in there, which are the rules that part of their lease agreement. So they would have to revisit the tariffs, and they did that with the Green Port policy to get the zero emission truck mandates met and some of the other things met. That every 5 years they have to open up those lease agreements and see if there's something that the terminal could be doing to be greener for example. So in this case, they would have to go to each of the 13 terminals, open up their lease agreement, and then build this in to do the push versus pull, because the port doesn't move the containers at the port of LA or Long Beach. The terminal operators do that lease out those facilities. So it could happen. It would just be a much harder effort for a port like that than, say, this South Carolina, where the state has control of those ports. And they could do it at the statewide level and implement it across the board. So it could definitely happen. It's just going to be a case by case basis, and each one would have to be individually shaped, is how I think of it. Cargo visibility options, that's the other one. So we are seeing more of that with flow, but I think the ports could also do more of that. So Port of Rotterdam, for example, does do that. The Port Authority itself has the non-disclosure agreement with all the shippers to help that visibility. But how would it work here? Why does it work there? Why hasn't it been tried here? That's one thing I would love to see some research on, because we know we have a good example. So, and the price elasticity thing, I think that's really interesting. So how I was mentioning that the cost of stuff all of a sudden went up 15%. If we look at each gateway and shippers had a better idea of how much more it was going to cost them, maybe they could have some backup plans to avoid those cost increases and prevent the inflationary increases that we've been seeing as a nation on goods. Inequitable distribution of the burden. Consumers, we are really not, we're seeing some of the price of things like in the grocery store go up, but when you order something on Amazon, I mean, I've had a couple of things that were like on reorder, and I do it in grouping, and I say, you can bring it whenever you want. I try not to be a bad consumer, but I haven't really noticed a huge increase on that side. So I think part of what's happening, I know the trucking industry has seen hits, but I think that consumers don't pay their fair share of even waste. So, fast fashion, for example, has been a big topic in the media. We don't really pay for the recycling impacts of having things delivered to our house. I think some of those externalities, if some of those were pushed down to the consumers, that might make it easier on the industry to not squeeze the smallest piece of the supply chain, which, it could be either on the export side or the import side, but the truck drivers tend to get hit the hardest most of the time because they get paid per load, sometimes per mile. Forecasting industry, I think that's the other thing where I talked about earlier, is just forecasting these different scenarios and seeing what kind of an impact it has on our gateways. So being landside and focused on road and rail, I'd really like to have a better understanding of if we had actually modeled the scenario that we're seeing right now with the Suez closure, and we saw a taste of it just like a year and a half, 2 years ago, when one of those vessels got stuck in there, and it was, we saw like a 3 or 4 day, it took them a while to move the vessel, and it backed up quite a bit. If we would have just thought about, oh goodness, what if there's major war conflict over there? What happens if it closes? If we just would have had some more foresight, and I think we could do more of that. I know I can think of 5 different scenarios right now that would be nice to test, but I think that would help the gateways, especially in the US, and also our exporters get a better handle on what their backup plan should be if something like this happens. So those are my thoughts, but does anybody else have any ideas?
Warehouse workers. So did you observe like the more investment into the automated systems? I know that you are leading some research on the automated tracking. And how about the warehouse? We have seen the video clips, those fancy robots, move around and get the stuff. So did you observe some new trends because of the interruption caused by COVID?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think more companies are investing in automation for that reason. Some of it's AI. So AI is even helping them to look at different trends in purchasing and trying to think ahead and see those problems coming. But yeah, automation in the warehousing, ports are looking more at automation. even the Port of Tampa Bay is considering automation at its container terminal just to be more efficient, to minimize those delays in getting the cargo off the facilities. But as far as autonomous trucks, they're certainly being tested everywhere, but there's so many challenges. And I think the number one challenge with autonomous trucks, as with autonomous cars, work zones. And they're especially tricky for trucks. So work zones are very difficult for just an autonomous truck to navigate. If you have to come to a sudden stop or if there's a sudden turn, trucks can't react as quickly as cars. So that's where the majority of the testing has really been focused on lately, is with trying to figure out how to improve work zone signage. I mean, even having QR codes that the trucks can read, so they get direct messages read, and that way you don't have to continuously change the sign. You just, somebody's in a room typing in what changes need to happen and the trucks need to pay attention to. I think it'll happen at some point. And I think we're going to see it on the long haul stretches. So think of I don't know, I-10 from California to Texas, or I-80 from California to, I don't know, Omaha. There are some stretches of those corridors where they tend to have fewer changes geometrically. The interstates are, their design standards are very similar. So for the trucks to be able to navigate them, the tricky part is making sure those trucks can get off the facility, be refueled, they get a flat tire, have some kind of an emergency. If there's an emergency closure on the road, that the trucks are able to figure out how to, in a snowstorm, go and find a place to park. So there's a lot of thoughts that are still going into that, but yes, the industry is certainly trying to address the labor shortage through automation.
There's
How do they charge?
how they charge the vessels coming in and out and using the ports, I think. Sarah, is that what you're asking?
Oh, thank you. I was just curious, with all of these disruptions, how have the ports, the seaports in Florida fared through all of this? Have we experienced any, special issues or benefits or opportunities going through this?
I know anecdotally, and I could probably put you in touch with somebody who's going to have a much better answer for this. But I know one thing that we've been seeing is, for example, things coming into Florida are where typically a lot of goods were coming into Southern California through LA Long Beach, largest seaport in our country, and being put on rail and shipped across. We're seeing the opposite happen now. That rail corridor is still being used to move things east or west to east, but this time we're seeing more of it go east to west. So that is something that we've been seeing. Like one of the companies said that they were bringing in shipments from Mexico into Florida and then putting it on a train and shipping it to the West Coast. So there is some of that, what I think of as like a contraflow occurring. So I think Florida's ports have been growing pretty steadily. As a matter of fact, I know Tampa Bay is almost at capacity and trying to figure out how to reclaim additional land to build additional terminals. So I think and I know Jacksonville is doing very well as well and looking to expand. So in general, I think the Florida ports are doing pretty well in spite of what's going on right now with some of the disruptions.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's some interesting discussion about is those canals either has some wars ongoing or has some the low water issue. So people are talking about using the airship, the bigger balloon, like it can carry tons and tons, 100 tons, 200 tons. Even it's slower than the commercial flights, but it could be faster than the ships going around those continents. So I don't know if you have heard, if you see anything, or if you do, what is your opinions on that?
I don't know any more about it than you do of what I've read. It hasn't come up in any freight studies as a serious topic yet, but I know there are some interesting ideas out there that are being explored, and air would certainly avoid some of the issues we're dealing with, but you still have weather events that a larger vessel like that flying in the air would have to contend with. So I don't know. I think it's worth researching. So if anybody wanted to take on air container vessels, that'd be fun.
Is the other route, in addition to longer cost, is it more unstable because of the harsh weather or the same stuff? So it's been.
Well, going around the Cape of Good Hope does, I mean, there are some, you have to be more concerned about weather, but not as bad as the Cape. Going around the Cape is much more dangerous. And they're considerate. That's why a lot of the cargo really doesn't want to go around the Cape. But around Good Hope, it's not quite as bad. And that's why you're seeing most of the rerouting right now, instead of going the longer way across the Pacific Ocean. It's going around the Cape of Good Hope.
Dangerous in terms of operation, environmental in terms of the
Weather, mostly.
weather,
Yeah, and just
not
the
things like parrots or something.
no, it's a longer route, but it's also a more difficult route to traverse.
Another question. The share of market of China. So yeah, the share of China is decreasing, but is it only because of those events, or maybe there are some other factors contributing to that decline? Maybe, I mean, people don't like China's product or quality or these kind of stuff. I don't know. So maybe I just was thinking.
Well, I think this is something we've been seeing though with China for a while, because their middle class is rising, and similar to what happened to the US when our middle class started to rise, those jobs weren't as attractive and our labor became more costly. So China's doing what we've done. They're outsourcing to Vietnam and India and other countries. And as those countries start to come up, then you're probably going to also start seeing some, I mean, Africa's been explored. So they try to find the lowest cost, and China's cost of living is going up. So they're moving those for that reason, not any others from what I know.
Any other questions from our audience?
Are there any other questions from the online audience?
Didn't see any.
Well,
Right,
thank you
so-
very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Let's give a round of applause for our presenter. Thank you for sharing, so much information about what's going on in the supply chain and virtual station.
I guess we don't need to be sharing all of that. So
Okay, so thank you for being here, and we do have pizza ready. And you can enjoy it, and I'll see you next Friday.
And I'm gonna share this slides with you.
Yeah, actually, it's recorded. I think Christina got the consent from you. We record all the presentations and put on the Cutter social media. So if you go there and if you go to the Cutter webpage, like USF Cutter Seminar, there's a webpage there. You can find all the information. Yeah.
And the one other thing I do that I know would be helpful, because I know I didn't present the SSA Marine and Use and Logistics the slides as perfectly as they did. So I have their full presentations, and I can share them because they're shareable. But I'll send those as well, and you can provide them.
Yeah, we can add the presentation slides on the webpage. So if you click it, you will be through the presentation.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank
Have a great weekend.